Can I have your attention, please? A little bit of administrative work first. So everybody has a sense. We'll be back at Fletcher. We're going to start it right precisely at 2:30 so we can get everything in on time. Our speaker was forthcoming in just a few moments. For the purposes of dinner tonight, if you have a room here, you're all set. Don't have to do anything more. If you don't have a room here and would like to be part of the dinner, and we have a dinner speaker, Judge Wall tonight, you have to buy a ticket, and they would like to know, because they're planning for a dinner, whether you plan on attending or not. So maybe as you depart, if you're interested, even if you don't buy the ticket immediately, just let them know what you intend to do.
Actually, I am introducing a speaker. I am not the speaker, but I do want to, as I look around the room and look at, gee whiz, all my friends and colleagues, and you can look around the room and say, gee whiz, look at all my friends and colleagues, because again, these dialogues were originally meant and have become really just a collegial get-together of friends and colleagues who are devoting or have devoted their lives to justice. For that, you should all be justly proud. We have many, many people we need to thank, but I do want to single out the members of the Jackson Center who really, even though they're just, quote, a sponsor, and there are many wonderful sponsors for this event, the Jackson Center does the hard work of the administration and the logistics. So members of the Jackson Center team, why don't you just stand up? I just want to say thank you. And of course, we would really want to recognize Carol Drake, but Carol Drake is out doing what Carol Drake does well. She's making things happen. What a wonderful beginning of this wonderful 2 days, and what a wonderful beginning last night. Bill Kamen, we are still just in awe of your talk, and so honored to actually have seen and been there. And Bill, thank you very much for being here and gracing us and representing the Nuremberg prosecutors and all who have gone before you. So thank you, sir. We've asked a good friend, someone who I have known of for almost a quarter century, someone who I've known for over 15 years personally, and I've gotten to know him better and better as we move together through our particular professions of seeking justice or trying to seek justice for the oppressed. I've asked my good friend to address you because I think that it's very, very important to reflect on how the United States and the Office of Special Investigation has evolved and how it's moving in an appropriate and correct direction and expanding its mission. And I think Eli will be talking more about how that is also beginning to change. But I've asked Eli if he would be so willing to talk about his office, talk about the role of women in his office and the important place that they have in the important mission of the Office of Special Investigation of the Department of Justice. Eli has a tremendous resume. He is a Penn, he's a Wharton undergrad, MBA, Harvard Law School. But more importantly, I would frankly say, and I think you would agree with me, he is kind of Mr. OSI, Mr. Office of Special Investigation. I know he wouldn't want to have that imperator, but you know, he started there as a summer intern in 1979, and now he heads it. And done everything in between. And he is the longest serving investigator and prosecutor of Nazi criminals in post-war history. And so with that, I think, important distinction, I'll introduce Eli Rosenbaum, my friend and colleague, and our colleague, who will talk about his office. Thank you, Eli.
Thank you, David, for those very, very generous words. It's great to be here. I learned only a short while ago that I would be your lunchtime speaker, but it's a privilege for me. I am sorry that Gail Smith from the Office of the President couldn't be here due to a scheduling problem. I will also try to be brief because we are behind schedule, and I know everyone is eager to get back to the program in chief. Gail Smith brings to mind a related subject, as do the inspiring images that we've seen projected in the last 2 days of Justice Jackson, Bill Kaming, who we're very honored to have with us today, the much-missed Henry King, and heroes like Ben Ferencz and Whitney Harris. I'd like to read a letter that was written to Professor Harris last month and given to him earlier this month on the occasion of his 97th birthday. Dear Professor Harris, it is an honor to join your family and friends in wishing you the best as you celebrate your 97th birthday. Your life and career are rich with unique moments and experiences. In your time, you have seen true evil and known true progress. Along with your fellow prosecutors at Nuremberg, you made a significant impact on our nation's understanding of human rights and, more importantly, strengthened the world's collective faith in justice. This legacy is worthy of tremendous respect and admiration. Please accept my warmest wishes on this happy occasion. Sincerely, Barack Obama, President of the United States. Whitney Harris, of course, is a mentor to the Jackson Center and a great friend of this marvelous institution, and I know we all wish him well as he fights a medical battle. I've been asked to talk briefly about the work of our office and about the role of women in the work that we do. For most of OSI's life, since its creation in 1979, we were working on the World War II cases, Nazi crimes, Japanese crimes, perpetrated by individuals who were living in the United States, that is, who immigrated to the United States after the war, or who sought entry either for immigration purposes or even just to visit. In 2004, as a result of a provision in the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, OSI's mission was expanded to include certain cases of perpetrators of post-World War II crimes. We share responsibility for what we in my office call the modern war crimes with the domestic security section in the criminal division, and an esteemed colleague of mine, Mike Segala, is here from that office. I think he's there, he's right here, Mike. And of course, we work very closely with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the FBI, and the State Department and other agencies. In our World War II work, of course, we encountered many cases in which women were victims, oftentimes victimized in a way that almost never happens to men. They were victims of sexual violence. I remember that most dramatically in our Japanese cases. About 13 years ago, having failed to obtain cooperation from the government of Japan in our investigative work, Japan to this day is the only country from which we have sought assistance that does not provide it. We were able, using our own resources, to identify people who were still alive in Japan who had participated either in the Unit 731 medical atrocities of the Japanese Imperial Army or in the so-called comfort women cases. These were women and girls, women and children, who, as you know, were abducted in China, in Indonesia, in Korea, and elsewhere that Japanese forces occupied, and they were put to work, so to speak, as sexual slaves, violated many times each day by officers and soldiers. Some of them were used as human shields near the end of the war. When babies were born, the babies were taken away. Many of the victims were killed by their Japanese captors. It was a total nightmare. The nightmare, of course, continued after the war because these women, I don't care, of course, for the expression comfort women, but it's actually the expression that the human rights NGOs that were formed specifically to fight for their rights used, so I hope I will be forgiven if I used it as well. They didn't even get a modicum of historical justice after the war. At least the Holocaust survivors have gotten that. But as you may know, there are many in Japan who deny that the crimes ever took place. There were, and perhaps still are, some Japanese officials who claim that these women, they don't like to talk about children, but that the women were volunteers and professional prostitutes, and that's an outrageous calumny. I think, I know that I will never forget meeting one of the victims, a woman who flew all the way in from Korea to meet with us. She was there with representatives of a Korean-American group, the Coalition for Comfort Women Issues, based in Washington. And a number of us who were prosecutors were in the meeting. And she told an absolutely horrific story of victimization that never really ended. She was unable to have children after the war because of what had been done to her, and that caused her marriage to fall apart. And of course, she was getting no compensatory justice nor really historical justice. And I would say the entire room was in tears by the time that meeting ended. A great, great and courageous lady who, by the way, though, said, you know, I could never speak in Korea and say the things there that I am saying here in this room. A short time later, in 1996, we decided we had enough evidence to bar these men whom I mentioned, perpetrators of medical atrocities and participants in the comfort women crimes, bar them from entering the United States. And we passed their names and identifying data on to the Departments of State, and at that time the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and the names were added to the watch list, the Border Control watch list, at which time we drafted a press release, as we had done in some of our Nazi cases, to announce that a category of offenders was now barred from entering the United States. Knowing that Japan had not been forced the way Germany had to confront its wartime past, we decided we'd better let the State Department see the text of our press release. No sooner had the text arrived than I was summoned to the Department of State to meet with some very senior people and to talk about our release, with which it was explained to us, a problem, a big problem. The problem being that we used the word rape, mass rapes, to categorize the crime. And I said, well, what's the problem with that? And they said, well, the Japanese don't use that word in connection with these events, and it will cause a great controversy in Japan. And the Japanese government will be discomfited by this. And I said, but you know, that's what the crime was. This was rape of women and children. Now, they really weren't happy about it. And finally, after going back and forth for 25 minutes, I guess it's hard to believe I could have been more arrogant when I was younger than I am now, but I said, well, you know, why don't we send this issue of the R word up the flagpoles at our respective agencies and see how Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and Attorney General Janet Reno feel about it. And that actually worked instantaneously, we compromised, I think, at one use of the R word up high in the press release. All of these cases, of course, are suffused with sadness, whoever the victim is or the victims are. But as I say, the cases involving women and girls as victims are of a special character. And one of the reasons we felt very strongly about issuing the press release, frankly, was, although it was not official government policy except for my office, was to give a boost to the human rights groups that were fighting for the rights of the survivors of those crimes. And we were very gratified at the reception that we got in the human rights community, a community that, although we are government employees and federal prosecutors, we like to feel we are part of. We also have, I'm sorry, I should tell you the denouement of that story. After the press release came out, I got a call from the Japanese embassy. It appears that the government in Tokyo, which was notified by the State Department, had neglected to alert their embassy in Washington. And a senior diplomat asked if he could meet with me, and I said, well, of course, when would you like to meet? This was about 5 o'clock. He said, tonight. No one had ever asked to meet at night. Sure, 7 o'clock, okay. And he came over with a lawyer from the embassy carrying a big book of treaties, and he was very upset about our announcement. And he said, you know, your press release says that these women were, some of them that they were tortured, they were raped, they were even killed. He said, what's the proof of that? I said, well, with all due respect, sir, this is really not open to historical debate. There are scholarly works written on this subject. Some of the men who were involved in this have spoken of it in Japan rather courageously. And beyond that, I said, we had the privilege of meeting here in this very room with one of the surviving victims. And he looked at me and sort of rolled his eyes, and he said, this woman, she was Korean? And I said, yes, as a matter of fact, she's from Korea. And he said, oh, I see. And then he said, you know, your law covers, makes excludable people who took part in persecution. He said, and it's not, how could it be that persecution was committed in this case because under some concept of international law that I'll turn to the international law practitioners here to explain to me. He said that when Japan occupied Korea, for example, that people who lived there became, by force of international law, Japanese nationals. So the victims could not have been persecuted on the basis of national origin because they were now of the same nationality as their tormentors. And I said, well, you know, our statute also speaks of persecution on racial grounds. Would you say, for instance, that these Korean women, say, were racially Japanese? And the two diplomats in unison went, racially? Oh, no, not racially. And then they had one other argument, which was that there was a treaty signed by the United States and Japan in the early part of the last century, 19-something, in which he said the two countries guaranteed that the other's nationals could enter one another's territory. And I apologized and said I wasn't familiar with that treaty. I was a young boy at the time. But that I was sure that the treaty did not guarantee that all of the two countries' nationals could enter the other's territories. And I said, in fact, I remember when I was a youngster that there was an incident that showed that the Japanese government accepts the concept that a sovereign nation has a right to determine which non-citizens may enter the country. I said, I recall that John Lennon of the Beatles was barred from entering Japan because he had a marijuana conviction, marijuana possession conviction, I believe, in the United States. And being a federal prosecutor, I was, of course, duty-bound to say, you know, while that's a very serious offense, it certainly pales by comparison with the crimes committed, you know, by Unit 731 and in the Comfort Women cases. And he was very embarrassed, and he looked down and he said, actually, it was Paul McCartney. So, with all due respect to Sir Paul, sorry about that. As David mentioned, and I speak for both of our offices, the Domestic Security Section and OSI, have from the start had women prosecutors and women leaders. The chief of the Domestic Security Section, Teresa McHenry, formerly a prosecutor at the ICTY in The Hague. I've had both of my principal deputies have been women, Ronnie Edelman and more recently Susan Siegel. And there have been times when I would say half or even slightly more than half of our prosecutors have been women. And we, of course, encourage women to apply for positions in our office. And one of the great privileges I had in my career was in 1996, the final reunion of Nuremberg staff, and it was held in Washington. At that time, you could actually assemble over 100 people, among them the great Telford Taylor. And one of the prosecutors I met at that conference was Belle Mayerzek. And really an extraordinarily accomplished person before Nuremberg, at Nuremberg, after Nuremberg, and also a wonderful, engaging person. And I asked her if there was any possibility that we could entice her to come down from Westchester and give a talk to our staff. I thought it would be not only fascinating, but a great morale booster for our staff to meet someone who had accomplished what she had. And I thought it would be a particular encouragement to our women's staff at all levels and our interns as well. And we were so lucky. She came down and did that, and she was hugely inspiring. And it's just something that none of us will ever forget. Greg Peterson recently asked me about that, and I told him, and he said, "Gee, did you tape it?" And I said, "No, I don't think so." And then I thought, wait a minute, we must have taped that. I wouldn't have let that go on without taping it. And so I checked, and we did, and the Jackson Center is now the home of the DVD of Belle Mayerzek speaking at the Department of Justice, and I hope that'll be more widely available soon, because it was just an absolutely extraordinary day for us at the Department of Justice. I think it's an extraordinary day for efforts to preserve, protect human rights, and to vindicate the rights of the victims of those crimes. We have a new administration. We have a new ambassador for war crimes issues coming in, following in very distinguished footsteps of his predecessor, Stephen Rapp, also a great friend of the Jackson Center, someone who has spoken here before and was a panelist last year. The head of the criminal division, Lanny Brewer, for whom Michael and I both work, has announced that our sections may be unified shortly. There'll be sort of a rationalization of the human rights law enforcement function within the Department of Justice. We have a president who has been quick to address human rights issues, both domestically and internationally, and has spoken so eloquently about the imperative of using the law and other tools at a great nation's disposal to protect human rights. It is an honor to serve under his leadership, an honor to serve in the Department of Justice with great colleagues like Michael and Teresa and the women and men of my office. And I thank you so much for putting up with me today.
Thank you, Eli, for pinch hitting. It was just a terrific message. And with that, we stand adjourned.